Our next speaker is going to be talking about scaling your WooCommerce store and WooCommerce in general, really. Some people have said that WooCommerce is really hard to scale. Things like caching, benchmarking, and monitoring come into play. Our next speaker is the CTO of Pagely, and he's going to be chatting to us about scaling WooCommerce. Ladies and gentlemen, please make a lot of noise, holler whoop, and slap your hands together in the a loud way, I guess, of showing appreciation for things. Please welcome Mr. Joshua Eichorn.
All right. All right. Welcome. Is this working? All right. So we'll just, as they pointed out, everybody loves to say that WooCommerce or WordPress in general can't scale. And there's always a story behind that. I installed this plugin and then my site went down, or I hosted my site for $3 a month and then it got on Reddit and then I just broke. And WordPress or WooCommerce doesn't scale because of that. And that's not really the right way to look at that. So I've been working with PHP at scaling for, it's PHP in general coming up on 20 years now, and very high scale stuff for the last 7 or 8. When I was at StumbleUpon, we were doing millions of requests of stumbles a day, all on PHP. And since I moved to Pagely, I've been able to take a lot of that same knowledge, working on that for all of our different customers at all different scale points with different problems. And so, when we're talking about scale, it can mean a lot of things. That might mean that I get a lot of traffic to my site. It might mean I do thousands of orders, or it might mean I have 10 million items in my catalog and I'm Amazon.com. And each one of those challenges takes different solutions. And when I originally did this talk, I tried to cover them all, but then it took me an hour and a half. So we had to cut things down. And so today we're just going to focus on how to manage a high volume of traffic. I'll cover some of the other things in general, but just not enough time for everything. So the first thing you need to have is realistic expectations. A successful store is going to generate a lot of activity. It's going to generate data from your sales, from your orders, from your email campaigns that you're running. And you can't expect to use the same hosting platform you would for a very simple blog with 2 posts a day. I always like to say, why would you expect to host your store on a service that costs less than your cell phone bill? It just doesn't seem a realistic expectation. And when you walk into it with that it should be your expectation, you're not going to get a lot of success. You're going to need a lot more MySQL capacity to scale WooCommerce. You're going to need more PHP capacity, more CPU, more memory. And then you're also likely going to want more access. You're going to be running a big email campaign, and you're going to need to be able to use tools like WP CLI and others to do those batch processes that you just can't do on those very simple hosting platforms. So in general, the story for WordPress and scaling is always caching. If you put Nginx or Varnish or something like that in front of WordPress, you can go from serving 10 users at the same time to 1 million with very little hardware difference. And when we think about that for blogs, that makes a lot of sense, right? You're writing a post, it's really static content. It's not changing per user. It's not even updating that often. And so when we look at e-commerce, we might say, oh, well, everybody's doing nothing but ordering on my site, so every single page is different, but that's not really the reality. A lot of the same rules of most of my content is static still apply. And just kind of as an example here, I set up a small Pagely VPS server, and here's it using our caching framework to produce results. And so you can see that it's doing every response in 2 to 3 milliseconds, all the way up to 1,000 concurrent users, which is pretty impressive for, this is a server that costs $400 a month. And so then this is where I purposely disabled the caching, and you'll see that very quickly, we go up to taking a second to make this response, and then everything breaks. And that's at like 40 concurrent users. And so the important thing to remember is no matter what you do to make PHP scale, if their first idea is that I should disable all caching, you're making the problem a lot harder. The caching layer works an order of magnitude better than scaling pure PHP. And so this kind of brings us back to, okay, why is WooCommerce hard to scale? And it's those personalization aspects. So it's your users have logged in because they're regular users and you show their history and all that on every page. Maybe you have a cart, most themes do, in the upper right corner that shows you have 8 items in your cart. So now it's a personalized page. And maybe you have some sort of tracking plugin that creates a PHP session, disables caching, and you're using that to track every click. It's this basic personalization is really the thing that you're fighting in scaling. And so the first thing to think of is possibly that personalization doesn't have to break caching. Like in a lot of those cases, only one thing was changed on the page, but we generated for each user just to show you how many items you have in your cart. We don't really need to do that. The other thing to think of is, well, I could just say once a user has done something like logged in or added something to their cart, then we'll turn caching off. But for everybody else, we can leave it on because they're just viewing that same product page. And so that kind of gives you the two solutions to easily scale caching. So the one, which is just turn off caching for a limited set of users, and the other is to keep it on for everybody, but move the personalization to the client side. So the first way is really easy. WooCommerce, out of the box, is set up so that you can have caching on unless somebody starts interacting with the cart. So you go to a page, you add something to the cart, and by default, you're going to get a WooCommerce items in cart cookie. And so once you do that, then you disable caching for only users with that cookie, and it's really simple. It's like so simple that, like, for example, if you're doing it in Nginx, you could be setting it up with that 20 lines of code. So very little effort, and you have caching. Now, in the real world, you might have other plugins and things like that, and so that 20 lines becomes, like in Pagely's case, a couple hundred lines of configuration to make it work. But it's still, it's a very successful strategy. And because it's built in out of the box, you can use this strategy with any WooCommerce theme. It's just going to work. No extra thought needed on your part. You would have to, make a lot of plugin changes and override functionality to break this. So it's like a really great starting point to how you can add caching to your site. But maybe you want to do personalization on a mass level. Every user that comes to your site from Google gets one sort of recommendations. Sites that come to you from your emails get another from a different affiliate network. And so then you would have to disable caching for the majority of your users, and then you lose that performance win that, if you remember, was an order of magnitude better at scaling than just pure PHP. If you're paying for the servers, that means paying for an order of magnitude more servers. And so that's where pushing the client-side personalization comes into play. So here's the idea is that instead of getting the count of the cart from the server, we can just store it in a cookie. And then in our caching framework, we ignore that cookie and don't disable caching when it's set. And so then we use some JavaScript to render the cart or to render our recommendations. Often it can be something as simple as loading your recommended content in with Ajax and passing them the query string that you're getting from Google Analytics from a campaign you're running or from your email campaign. And so maybe that small section of your site, your recommendations is dynamic, but the majority of your site is still static, giving you that ease of scalability. The downside of client-side personalization is this isn't out of the box. It's going to be dependent on your needs, what you're trying to do. And so when you're developing your theme, you're going to have to use this as a strategy from the start. It also can be very hard to just add in. If you have all of your logic for rendering your template in PHP, and now you want to do part of it in JavaScript, all of a sudden now you either have to keep 2 sets of code in sync, or you need to rewrite your entire theme. But if you start from right from the start and say, okay, here's the parts that need to be dynamic for all my user base, it's really quite simple to do. And it's that kind of planning ahead on how personalization is going to work that makes things easier to scale. So, you got the site, you've managed your basic personalization needs, so you're like, okay, every problem solved. Well, I wish it was that easy, but it's not always the case. So maybe your traffic actually is very heavy on repeat users who are, looking through their transaction history, interacting with you very heavily in that way, which, is a great problem to have, but it means that your scaling problems are totally different than, say, a site where it gets traffic in from Google and most users do one sale, one purchase ever with you. And so, the general idea is that the more successful your site is, the harder it's going to be to scale. But, that's kind of works nicely. As long as you make sure that's the way it works. I'm more successful, I have more scaling problems, then you can afford to scale. What you want to be very careful to not do is, no matter how much traffic I get, how many sales I get, the scaling problems are the same. Once you put yourself in that boat, then it makes it very hard to run a successful business because these external factors that drive your traffic drive your costs, not the success of your store. And so there's a couple things that of course can hurt that, and the biggest probably is extremely large catalogs. So if you have a large catalog, you're going to get low cache hit rates no matter what, because the amount of traffic per page is going to be very low. Well, unless it's not, but then you're probably Amazon, and it's a totally different problem. And so that's one area where you would have to address your scaling problems totally different if you had 100,000 items in your catalog. But you'd have a whole lot of other issues too if you had 100,000 items. A user interface for managing 10,000 or 1,000 items in your product catalog is very different than one for 100,000. And WooCommerce is focused more on those smaller catalogs, and not the super large. And a big reason why I think that is because once you're to huge numbers of items in a catalog, every tool is really custom to the sort of products you're selling. And generic solutions are very hard to do. So, once you're looking at, okay, caching doesn't solve my problem, you got to think of why is my site slow? So it might be slow because we're running some PHP code, that's your templates, that's your plugins. You might be doing queries against MySQL to get data, and so the web server's waiting around while the database does something. You might be talking to an object cache because you've installed that to speed things up, but every time you talk to that, there's some time to get that data back. And PHP is running through and rendering your page in a serial manner, starting at the top and going down until I can send a page to the client. So while it's waiting for MySQL or the object cache or to read things from a file or talking to Facebook or some external service, it's just sitting around and waiting. And so oftentimes, I'll get this bug request in from a client and they'll be like, my homepage takes 5 seconds to load. And so I'll go through and I'll trace what it's doing, and it's doing 10 requests to Facebook to render that homepage. And no matter what we do in any sort of the infrastructure, if you're making those 10 requests to that external service, you're going to be waiting around for the time it takes to happen. And in Facebook's case, it might seem not that bad. They have thousands of servers and high uptime, but even they have problems. And besides the fact that your site's hard to scale, now your uptime is relying on another service being up. And as soon as they have a hiccup, you go down too. And so it's very important to think of how you're interacting with all the different types of data when you're looking at scaling. And besides, and this is kind of the area where you do the most to hurt yourself in scaling. So out of the box, you got a very fast, scalable product that's going to work to very high traffic levels. And if you combine that with caching, even for 70-80% of your traffic, really no problems at very reasonable size servers. But you can throw that all out the window with one bit of design. Kind of the standard one is I want to show 500 products at a time on my page. Or I build a fancy menu system that has thousands of items in it. And it all seems great, but each one of those items was doing a query either against the object cache or the database to get the data to render that piece. And so that waiting time adds up. Maybe it's just 1 millisecond each, but 1 millisecond times 500 items is half a second of wait time. Now all of a sudden we have something that's slow and it's hard to scale because of that. Not just because it's hard to scale because it's slow, but because of how many requests it did to that backend for data. And now we have to make sure that it has enough capacity to respond to all those requests. And then as I mentioned earlier, hitting that external service on every page load. Kind of in the generic WordPress world, this is probably the thing that gives people the problems the most. They install a plugin that gives functionality they think's great. This might be some sort of social proof widget for your e-commerce store, showing your friends who also bought this product, or giving you the ability to share to them, showing you that Facebook like count. But for every single one of those products, every single time you load it, you're often hitting Facebook. And that really leaves you in a world where you can't scale it. And so, oftentimes scaling is understanding what the features need to do their job. So you can't just say, well, this plugin has a 5-star rating, I'll install it. Because maybe everybody who rated has very small traffic profiles, or maybe they only have one of those buttons on a page at a time. And so it works fine for them. But in your store and how you want to use it, that might not work. And it's very easy to run into problems when you don't understand, what those different plugins are going in. And that's often when you hear the stories of WooCommerce doesn't scale comes into play. And that's because somebody picked a plugin, didn't understand what it did, and maybe the author never had anything at scale themselves, so they never did any testing. A case that I ran into a month ago, a client, he had a WooCommerce store that had been around for a long time. It had 80, 90,000 orders in the history. And so they installed a plugin that allowed them to generate PDF invoices. And that plugin decides that on install that it should generate a PDF invoice for all of your backlog of orders. And so, of course, their site went down because you can't generate 80,000 invoices in a reasonable amount of time. It's the sort of problem that, on that test site that the developer is using with 3 orders in the history, everything works fine. But in your real-world site, things don't work so great. And it's very easy to say, okay, I'm picking my plugins based on functionality, or I'm picking my theme based on functionality and how it looks. But if you're planning to have any scale at all, that's not enough. You also need to say, okay, how does it perform that? Is it doing huge amounts of requests to my database, which is pretty easy to find. There's tons of debugging plugins. And is it doing huge amounts of requests to external services? You can use those same debug bars, et cetera, to see that. And it's very important to keep that in mind. So then the second thing is, okay, I have this functionality. I've made good choices. How much server do I need? And so, if you ever configure PHP, or Apache, you'll be like, oh, there's the option here that says how many concurrent workers I can have at a time. So if I want to scale to really high heights, I'll just put that number higher. And now I can serve 500 requests at a time, and everything will be fine, but it doesn't actually work that way. So each one of those requests, it needs time for the CPU to run that PHP code. And so the more requests you have, the less time you're giving for the server to process each request, and the more time just switching back and forth between those different workers. So what you have to do is figure out what's the right trade-off. So remember, we have things that use CPU, and then we have things that are waiting on those external services on data access. So you have to find that right trade-off. So there's a really simple benchmarking tool called Apache Bench. And it's not useful for most things, but for this activity, it's actually really useful for, because it has a simple switch that allows you to increase the concurrency. So you do a little benchmark and say, okay, here's running my site. I'm disabling caches because I'm purposely trying to benchmark the non-cache mode. And so I say 2 concurrent users hit my site, and you just have it run for a couple minutes, and you can just watch what the CPU activity is on your site. And if it's at that 2 already at 100%, then well, that's all I can do at once. But if it's at a much lower number, which it normally is, then it means you can increase that concurrency in your config. And that's because you have some amount of waiting that you're doing rather than actually building your site. Waiting on data access, waiting on hitting an API. And so, it's a pretty simple strategy. You just keep increasing that number until your CPU is maxed out. And then maybe you go a little bit more on the idea that sometimes waiting will be more often. You'll be waiting more than you normally do. And so that gives you a little extra capacity so you can have more things waiting at once. But the reason you didn't want to just put it to say 500 at once was A, that means you're going to hit other limits, like the amount of memory on your server, and then everything will explode. And then the other is just that it'll get slower. And so the general idea is, you're looking at this, you're increasing it, and you don't want to see, as you're increasing that concurrency, for the time per request to increase by very much. If we went way back to that original graph, you see, there was that curve where at a certain point, we go straight up. So, for a while, each additional user hitting our site increased us at a pretty linear rate. It made the sites 1 or 2% slower. But at a certain point, you're going to be past the amount of CPU you have. And so instead of building pages, you're just going to be switching back and forth, trying to spend a little bit of time on each one and not actually doing anything. And so it's you want to configure your server so it's stopping before that point. So rather than every time you get a bunch of traffic you fall over, you'll just maybe start giving error message to some users, which is not perfect, but at least then you can track those error messages. And if you're getting them all the time, well, I need a bigger server. And it's a whole lot nicer than getting paged or not getting paged because you don't have any monitoring of your server and your customers just being unable to order their products. So that kind of brings us to the next point. Okay, I know for this server that I have how much capacity it can do. But I'm projecting more traffic. I'm going to run the successful campaign, and I know I'm going to need a lot more capacity. So what kind of capacity do I get? And the general rule is you can either scale out, so add a whole bunch more servers, or you can scale up, get a bigger server. And scaling up is always easier. And it's generally cheaper too, at least in the cloud service industry. Because as you scale out, there's amount of fixed overhead for each server. But when you scale up, well, it's just the same overhead as that one server, and so you're not paying any of those overhead costs. Now, you might want to scale out anyways for other reasons. If you have 2 servers, you could do maintenance on one, or on a cloud setup, resize it, while the other one's still serving traffic. But it often would make sense to use 2 larger servers than 10 smaller servers, even if they were the same cost, because in those 2 larger servers, you would actually be getting more capacity for your dollar. And then the other thing is there may be some things that you want to split out simply because they have different needs. So like splitting MySQL out from the same place as your web server is probably the first thing you want to do. And that's because the amount of RAM and CPU and disk access MySQL does is very different than PHP. And so if you want to scale things and you have to try to figure out which part of the server capacity is being used by MySQL versus PHP, it makes the problem a lot harder. Where if they're on 2 different servers, then you can provide these same scaling exercises one at a time, watch each server, and you made your problem a lot easier. And then, of course, there's also things like backup and monitoring that might be more important for you on the MySQL side than on that web server side. Because those web servers, if you're doing things right, are pretty replaceable. But those MySQL servers, those have your orders in them. Those are the most important data you have. And if you lost that, it's the sort of data where you often have to shut the company down. There's just no way around it. And so the carefulness is very important. So as you're scaling out, you need to figure out how you're going to direct traffic to those multiple servers. And so the first thing you're going to have to look at is you need some sort of load balancer to manage traffic. And so there's lots of options for that. If you use Amazon Web Services, they have a product for it. If you use Linode, they have a caching product for it. And then there's the big open source options in Nginx and Varnish that most people use for that. But the second part that you have to figure out is, okay, I have this content, my image assets and things that need to be on each web server so they can serve them up to clients. And that's probably the hardest thing that you have to figure out when you're scaling to multiple servers. There's kind of 2 packages that we often look to for that. One is the distributed replicated block. I don't remember the full name of it, but it's a file system that allows you to write on one server and those writes to be distributed out at the very core Linux level out to other servers. And it's kind of a pain to set up, but it works really well. And there's another project called lsyncd, which is really simple to set up and does that same sort of copying, only asynchronously. And so it's like a great choice for most people is to do something really simple like that. You do have obviously a little window before the file's copied from one server to other, but for most use cases in WordPress, that's not an issue. That next view is going to be in WordPress admin. You're not creating something and then it's going and being viewed by users immediately. So that millisecond or two of delay isn't an issue at all. And on the MySQL side, scaling out is a little harder. So all your rights, without a whole lot of work that WordPress really isn't designed to do, need to go to one master server. And so that means you need to just keep making that master server bigger. Now the one thing you can do though is MySQL has a very well understood and supported slave mechanism. So you can create read-only slaves and direct read traffic to them, so that one server that all the write traffic has to is really only managing that write traffic. And so that definitely helps it. And once you're going into those multiple servers, the HyperDB drop-in is kind of the standard solution for that. Its configuration is pretty simple. You just say I have X number of servers, and these ones take reads, and these ones take writes. You can do some additional monitoring that you can hook into, looking at slave lag. And so you can say, if the slave is lagged, then go directly to the master. But you have to be very careful with just a blanket statement like that, because that's often a good way to make your site collapse. So you have a large amount of traffic that's causing lots of writes, the slaves get behind, and then you push all that extra traffic that you're getting to one machine, and then everything goes down. So oftentimes you would just have to say, well, we'll live with that delay and just page us instead, so we can look at if there's something wrong that can be solved manually. It's very easy to get in sort of automated monitoring that seems like it would solve the problem, but actually just leads you to the next problem. So when you're so before we get to questions, I just want to cover a couple other things that I pulled out of my slides, but now I have a little bit of time here. So the biggest mistake that most people make when they're writing custom functionality for WooCommerce is they rely heavily on post-meta fields. And so it's this great structure that allows you to put any sort of data related to any of your products in them. But it's not designed to be used for searching against the values. So everything in post-meta has a key and a value. And the values are all stored in MySQL as a very generic, very large type, so you can put anything you want into them. But it means anytime you're querying against it, it's very slow. So you often be like, okay, I want to power my user interface based off search, based off secondary attributes in my products. Maybe, it's what type of business they're best for, what colors they are, whatever, and those all end up in post-meta. And then you do a bunch of complex queries against them to do the searching. And you have a site that pretty much won't scale. That access pattern against MySQL, no matter how big you make that server, won't work. The algebraic query that you're building on the MySQL side is going to be a kind of a product of each one of those things multiplied against each other for each one you add as a query. And then you're scanning through all this data. That's the slowest thing MySQL can do. So it'll seem fine when you have one attribute, and then maybe okay at 2, but at 4 or 5, it'll just collapse. Your page will take 5-10 seconds to run, and you'll buy a more expensive server, and it'll still take 5-10 seconds to run. And so if you need to power your user interface off something like that, you need to either look for a different tech stack, or you need to store that data in custom MySQL tables where you design indexes to speed that access. There is one trick you can do though, and that is to, instead of putting the searches against the values, is to search against the keys. So the keys are limited size, but they are indexed. So it's a very nice trick, especially if you just need 2 or 3 things, to instead build things in a way that you can search against the keys to do that filtering. And then you can use the values to store all the details. It's great for that. There's really no limit when you're showing one product at a time, how much data you can pull out of that post-meta. I mean, eventually I guess your HTML page will get so big that it'll be ridiculous. But till you get to that point, it's great for that feature. It's just really the searching against post-meta that's the problem, or user meta if you're doing something related to users' history to recommend them content. And that's often the biggest problem that we'll see in just WordPress plugins in general, but in any kind of search-based WooCommerce plugin that often comes up because they want to search against those features. And as far as if you need to pull in a different piece of technology to solve that, really Elasticsearch is the best solution for that. In the WordPress space, the plugins around Elasticsearch are still a little immature, but the server side is very mature at this point, and it really gives you all the flexibility you need. And it's designed around accessing data in those patterns you're thinking about when you're building a search-based interface. I mean, it seems simple to say, oh, when we're doing search, if you use a search engine, it'll work better than using a database, but it's often something that people think because your general hosting providers come with a database, they don't come with a search engine. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Most of my clients are on the box, and they're not going to make a lot of customization when it comes to that. So, WooCommerce, you're saying that something like WP Dash is their response time?
It won't drag down the response times. It's just that, there's a lot of different ways you can configure WP Supercache. The one way you can configure it is that it skips Apache. So it won't do as good as, say, an Nginx-based solution, but it will solve the main problem, which is kind of once you start running code in PHP, it's going to take 100 milliseconds. You're just not going to get less than that. But if you can serve that cache without hitting PHP, you can do it in under 10. And it's that kind of order of magnitude difference that is not, there's no possible way in the current PHP stacks to get things under 10 milliseconds. If you use HHVM, you can probably get it under 30, but that would be very hard to do with WordPress. You probably have to specifically disable things in core that you weren't using to get that shutter speed. But if you can skip PHP, you can get there no problem. Yes?
I'm curious about essentially who would do this kind of work, because I know there's some hosting companies here.
Sure. So at Pagely, we do a lot of this work for our customers. We have a caching configuration that works out of the box with WooCommerce based on that first strategy of caching content until you have items in your cart or you're logged in. But for larger customer engagements, kind of at our VPS tier and higher, we will write custom cache config for whatever custom plugin and theme work you're doing. As far as writing a plugin to change your access patterns to say use Elasticsearch, we support Elasticsearch, but we wouldn't write your plugin for you. And that's kind of the general strategy. Is most of the hosting providers will either have a default caching layer that knows about WooCommerce, and pretty much all of them do, or will provide you custom caching solutions. But most of them won't go in and rewrite your code for you. Though, at least at Pagely, we will provide you data to help you rewrite it.
I've got two questions really quick.
Sure.
Just right here. One, you'd mentioned a tool, I missed the name of it, the Apache testing?
Apache Bench.
Apache Bench, is that just apachebench.com or?
It comes with the Apache web server.
Okay, I see.
So you can just do apt-get install AB or yum install AB.
Okay, cool. And then the other question is for, echoing some of the other questions, where we have clients that'll be like a mom-and-pop type situation. Is there, one of the things as we're looking for plugins, you brought up a point where you're like, just because it has 5 stars doesn't mean it's going to be scalable. Is there, sorry, I'm getting feedback. As I am approaching a theme author or a plugin author, is there a specific question maybe that we could ask them, just like a layman's question that would give us an indication quickly whether or not it's going to, red flags that,
Maybe, but most of the time, the authors who are making the performance problems don't realize they're doing it. And so really my best advice is to just set up a test environment, and not one without any data in it, but either, generate the data or use data from another customer who's been around for a while. Often everything looks fine when you have no order history or 10 products in the catalog, but then things fall apart later. Because there's no easy solution besides reading the code of the plugin and understanding what it's doing, which can be, really time consuming. It's often quicker to do testing than to read the whole code. I mean, especially if you're not comfortable reviewing other people's code.
Hi, I'm Julia. My question is more business question. I'm not that technical, but it's about the plugin. I manage stores that are usually on homegrown platforms or Magento or bigger platforms. And right now we're trying to launch a store on WooCommerce. And I imagine we're going to have 5,000 orders a month, 10,000 a month. And I feel uncomfortable running orders on a plugin, on that specific plugin. I want to connect to all different systems like other order management, marketing automation, and I want to have one system where everything goes versus go into that plugin interface and manage orders. What would you recommend? Would you recommend even to use that, or?
I mean, every kind of, on the scaling side, every scenario ends up being different. And so there's not necessarily a problem, with hitting those external services to centralize that data. It's just you have to look at when is that hit. If it happens in the admin UI, well, maybe the admin UI is a little slower as you wait for responses from those services, but that's not a big deal. But if that happens on every page load, then it is a big deal. So it's really just understanding when the data is used and when those requests are made. Often if it's used on the front end, they just need to add caching. WordPress has a transients caching API that's built for caching the responses to API requests. So if they've thought about it and done proper caching, everything will be fine. But there's really, in general, like the simplest benchmarking you can do, which is put real data in your database, take pages, look at a stopwatch, or use the capability in Chrome or Firefox with Firebug to look at page response times. Just look at how long it takes this page to load. If it takes multiple seconds, you're going to have scaling problems. And you need to then start digging into what's causing those. You should be at, in worst case, half a second on a decent hosting provider with WooCommerce. And if you're past that, then it's something you've done in themes and plugins to make it there.
So you wouldn't run your big scale store on a plugin? My question is more like if I have a person in-house who will be logging into the plugin and managing orders, and they're coming in volume, 5,000, 10,000 a month, will that impact the site, or?
I couldn't say without looking at the actual plugin. Really kind of the best advice I have is to actually do a test run with fake orders in there. And, nothing beats testing on your hardware, on your data, on your setup. It's really easy to be like, anything will scale, but it's the same thing, anything won't scale, and nothing beats actual testing.
All right, thank you guys. We've got time for one more question for Joshua.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
About product attributes, which you spoke about towards the end. There are two implementations of attributes in WooCommerce. There are like the custom attributes, which are stored as post meta, but there's also the global attributes, which are stored as custom taxonomies. What's your opinion on custom taxonomies and scaling them? Is it less of an issue than post meta?
I can't think of the schema off the top of my head to remember what the difference are. But if you look at the MySQL database and the value that you're searching against is a long char or a very generic type like that, then it won't scale. Where if it's a varchar, then you're fine. It's kind of the simple rule. So if you just look at the MySQL database and look at where your data goes, that's the rule. If it's in a long char, you're going to have scaling problems. If it's in a varchar, you'll be fine.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua Eichorn. Thank you for your time, sir.